What if I told you that a gang of ordinary working-class men pulled off the most daring robbery in British history? And for a few glorious days, they got away with it completely. No high-tech gadgets, no Hollywood explosions, no inside man at a bank. Just brilliant planning, military precision, split-second timing, and one catastrophic mistake that brought the whole thing crashing down. This is the story of the Great Train Robbery, August 8, 1963. And trust me, it's wilder than anything you've ever seen in a movie. But before we get into the robbery itself, we need to understand the world these men came from. Because without that context, the story makes no sense at all. Britain in the late 1950s and early 1960s was a country in transition. The Second World War had ended less than 20 years earlier. Cities were still being rebuilt. Entire neighborhoods that had been flattened by German bombs were slowly coming back to life. But the scars were everywhere, in the architecture, in the economy, and most of all, in the people. An entire generation of British men had grown up in poverty and chaos. Their fathers had fought in the war. Many hadn't come back. The ones who did come back were often broken in ways that nobody talked about in those days. Mental health wasn't a concept that working-class families in London had the luxury of discussing. You just got on with it. You survived. And in that environment, a certain kind of man emerged. Tough, street smart, fiercely loyal to his friends, deeply suspicious of authority, and completely unwilling to accept that the world owed him nothing just because he had been born poor. These were the men who populated London's criminal underworld in the early 1960s, and they were a very specific type of criminal, not violent thugs, not drug dealers, not the kind of disorganized, chaotic criminals you might imagine. These were professional men, organized men, men who planned their operations with the kind of precision and discipline that would have impressed a military commander. They called themselves thieves. They wore suits. They had codes of conduct. They looked after their own. And they were very, very good at what they did. Bruce Reynolds was one of these men, and he was different from almost all of them. Reynolds was born on September 7, 1931 in Chiswick, a district in West London. His childhood was unremarkable in the way that most working-class London childhoods were unremarkable in that era. Not much money, not much opportunity, but a loving family and a neighborhood full of people who understood each other. From an early age, Reynolds showed signs of being different. He was curious in a way that most of his peers were not. He read books. He visited art galleries. He developed a genuine appreciation for fashion, style, and the finer things in life. He dreamed not just of having money, but of living well, of being someone. The problem was that the legitimate paths to that kind of life were largely closed to someone like Reynolds. In post-war Britain, the class system was still deeply entrenched. Your accent, your school, your postcode, these things determined your future in ways that are hard to imagine today. A working-class boy from Chiswick with no connections and no qualifications was not going to end up in a Mayfair restaurant ordering fine wine through legitimate means. So Reynolds chose a different path. He started small, shoplifting as a teenager, then burglary, then more organized theft. He was arrested several times in his youth and served short prison sentences. But rather than being put off by these experiences, prison seemed to sharpen him. He used his time inside to think, to plan, to meet other criminals and learn from them. By his mid-20s, Reynolds had developed a reputation in London's underworld as a man of exceptional intelligence and nerve. He was methodical. He was careful. He thought through every possible angle of a job before he committed to it. And he had an instinct for knowing when something was right and when it wasn't. He also had something else, something rarer than intelligence or nerve. He had vision. He could see possibilities that other people couldn't see. He could look at a situation and imagine what it could become. And in 1962, he looked at the Royal Mail and saw something extraordinary. He had heard through contacts in the criminal world that the overnight mail trains running between major British cities were carrying enormous amounts of cash, not new notes, old ones, used banknotes that had circulated through the economy and were being sent back to London to be taken out of circulation and destroyed. The Bank of England regularly recalled old notes and replaced them with new ones. And the most efficient way to move large quantities of cash around the country in 1963 was by train. Reynolds started asking questions, carefully, quietly. He used his network of contacts to find out everything he could about these cash runs. Which trains carried the most money, which routes they took, which days the biggest shipments traveled, how the security was arranged, how many staff were on board. What he discovered was remarkable. The security was almost non-existent. The post office ran these cash runs with minimal protection because nobody had ever robbed a moving train before. It simply hadn't occurred to anyone that it was possible. But Reynolds could see that it was not only possible, it was achievable. With the right team, the right plan, the right location. He identified the Glasgow to London overnight mail train as the target. It ran every week, and on certain runs it carried enormous amounts of cash. His inside contacts, including a man named Brian Field, who worked for a law firm with post office connections, told him that on certain nights, the train carried up to £5 million in old notes. £5 million. In 1963, money, untraceable, unregistered, perfect. Reynolds began planning, and he planned with the obsessive detail of a man who understood that in an operation of this complexity, every single variable had to be accounted for. He identified the perfect location, a stretch of track near Bridigo Railway Bridge in Buckinghamshire. Rural, isolated, no houses within earshot, a B road running directly underneath the bridge, and most importantly, a railway signal that could be tampered with to stop the train. The plan was this: a small team would tamper with the trackside signal, covering the green light and wiring a battery to the red light to make it illuminate. The train driver, seeing a red signal, would bring the train to a stop. The gang would then overpower the crew and take control of the locomotive. They would move the train a short distance to the bridge, and then, in a move that Reynolds had borrowed conceptually from military supply chain operations, they would form a human chain and pass the mailbags from the train down the embankment to a fleet of waiting vehicles on the road below. Simple, elegant, audacious. Now he needed the team. Reynolds spent months carefully selecting his crew. He needed exactly the right people. Too many, and the operation became unwieldy, and the risk of someone talking increased dramatically. Too few, and they wouldn't have enough manpower to move the bags quickly enough. He settled on 15 men. Each one was chosen for a specific reason. Gordon Goody, tough, reliable, experienced. Charlie Wilson, cool under pressure, completely trustworthy. Buster Edwards, charismatic, fearless, one of Reynolds's closest friends. Roy James, a racing driver with exceptional vehicle skills who would handle the convoy. Brian Field, the inside man with access to post office information. Roger Cordry, an expert on railway signals who could handle the technical side of stopping the train. And then there were the others, each one chosen, each one briefed, each one given a specific role and told to stay in their lane. There was one more crucial position to fill. Someone had to drive the train once they took control of it. None of the gang knew how to operate a steam locomotive. They needed someone with that specific knowledge. They found a man. His identity has never been definitively established. The gang knew him only as Stan. He claimed to have experience with trains. Reynolds brought him in and gave him the single most important job in the entire operation. It was, as it turned out, the decision that almost derailed everything. The gang also needed a base of operations, somewhere to retreat to after the robbery, somewhere remote enough that the police wouldn't stumble across it immediately, somewhere with enough space to store the money and enough rooms to house 15 men for several days, while the initial heat from the robbery died down. They found Leatherslade Farm, a remote property in the Buckinghamshire countryside, about 27 miles from the target location. They rented it under a false name. They stocked it with food and supplies. They prepared it as a safe house. Everything was in place: the signal, the location, the team, the vehicles, the farm. On the night of August 7th, 1963, 15 men gathered quietly at various points across the English countryside and made their way to the positions that Reynolds had assigned them. They were dressed in dark clothing. Some wore military-style overalls. They moved quietly and without drawing attention. The Glasgow to London mail train left Glasgow on schedule, carrying 120 mail bags stuffed with used banknotes. The total value on board that night was later estimated at £2.6 million, somewhere between 50 and 60 million pounds in today's money. At approximately 3 a.m. on August 8th, the train approached the signal near Bredigo Bridge. The signal showed red. The driver, a 58-year-old man named Jack Mills, applied the brakes and brought the train to a stop. The gang moved. Within seconds, they had swarmed the locomotive. Jack Mills and his assistant David Whitby were overpowered almost immediately. Whitby offered no resistance and was tied up quickly. Mills resisted briefly and was struck over the head with a kosh. He was hurt, not killed, but the blow caused an injury that would affect him for the rest of his life and that the gang would later deeply regret. It was the one moment of real violence in an otherwise clinical operation, and it haunted several of them in the years that followed. Now came the moment that Reynolds had planned for but couldn't fully control. Stan climbed into the locomotive cab. He looked at the controls, and he froze. He couldn't drive it. Whether he had deliberately lied about his experience or had simply panicked when faced with the real machinery, nobody ever established with certainty. But the man who had been brought in specifically to drive the train, the man whose entire purpose in the operation was to move the locomotive to the bridge, could not do his job. Reynolds made a decision in seconds. They forced Jack Mills, injured, shaken, afraid, back into the cab. At gunpoint, they ordered him to move the train forward to the bridge. Mills did as he was told. The train moved and pulled to a stop exactly where Reynolds needed it. The human chain began. 15 men lined up on the embankment in the darkness. One by one, the mailbags were lifted from the train and passed hand to hand down the slope to the road below where the vehicles were waiting. It was physical, exhausting work. Each bag was heavy, the embankment was steep and uneven, and they were working in almost complete darkness. But they worked like a machine. Bag after bag after bag, moving in rhythm, moving in silence, moving with the discipline of men who had been told exactly what to do and had committed to doing it perfectly. 120 bags. It took 15 minutes. Then they loaded the vehicles, Army surplus trucks that had been acquired specifically for this purpose. They drove away through the quiet Buckinghamshire countryside in convoy. No sirens, no pursuit, no drama. Just 15 men and £2.6 million disappearing into the English night. They arrived at Leatherslade Farm as dawn was beginning to break over the countryside. They pulled the vehicles inside. They closed the doors. And then, for the first time since the operation began, they allowed themselves to feel what they had done. They had pulled it off. The next few days at the farm were extraordinary. The gang counted the money. It took hours. Notes were everywhere, stacked on tables, spread across floors, stuffed into bags and cases. 2.6 million pounds in used banknotes, filling the rooms of a farmhouse in rural Buckinghamshire. They ate well, they drank, they laughed, they told stories. The tension of the operation dissolved into relief and euphoria, and a kind of disbelief that it had actually worked. And then someone produced a Monopoly set. The image of 15 professional criminals sitting around playing Monopoly with real stolen banknotes, standing in for the game's paper money, has become one of the most iconic images in British criminal history. It perfectly captures something about these men, their humor, their irreverence, their almost theatrical sense of their own legend. But while they were playing Monopoly, the investigation was already beginning. The robbery had been discovered within hours. The scale of it was unprecedented. The post office, the police, and the government were all immediately aware that something extraordinary had happened. Scotland Yard launched one of the biggest investigations in British criminal history. Hundreds of officers were deployed. Roadblocks were set up across the region. Appeals went out to the public. The plan had always been to leave the farm within a few days, to clean it thoroughly, to split up and disappear separately, to lay low for months before spending any of the money. But the gang stayed longer than they should have, partly because of the euphoria, partly because the roads were full of police, and when they finally did leave, they left in too much of a hurry. They didn't clean the farm properly. Fingerprints on the Monopoly board, on kitchen surfaces, on cups and plates, on vehicles, on furniture, everywhere. A local farmer noticed that the property had been recently occupied and called the police. Officers arrived and found a treasure trove of forensic evidence that blew the investigation wide open. One by one, the gang members were identified. One by one, they were arrested. The trials were sensational. Britain hadn't seen anything like them. The robbery had captured the public imagination in a way that few crimes ever have. There was something almost romantic about it. The audacity, the scale, the Monopoly game. People who would never dream of breaking the law found themselves secretly rooting for the robbers. The judge did not share this sentiment. The sentences handed down were savage. Most of the core gang received 25 years in prison. It was an extraordinary length of time for a robbery in which nobody had been killed. The judge was sending a message, and the message was heard. But the story didn't end in the courtroom. Ronnie Biggs had played a relatively minor role in the robbery. He had helped recruit Stan, the man who couldn't drive the train, which meant his contribution had arguably made things harder rather than easier. He received 25 years like most of the others. He served 15 months. In July 1965, Biggs escaped from Wandsworth Prison by scaling the wall with a rope ladder thrown over by accomplices outside. He fled to France, then to Australia, then, most famously, to Brazil. In Brazil, Biggs lived openly. He gave interviews. He appeared in documentaries. He became one of the most recognizable faces in Britain, despite, or perhaps because of, being a fugitive. For over 30 years, he lived in Rio de Janeiro, unable to be extradited because Brazil had no extradition treaty with the United Kingdom and because Biggs had fathered a Brazilian child. He became a tourist attraction. Visitors to Rio would seek him out. He sold his autograph. He appeared on television. He lived a life that seemed almost designed to taunt the British authorities who couldn't touch him. He finally returned to Britain voluntarily in 2001, elderly, in poor health, and by his own account, missing home. He was immediately arrested and returned to prison. He was released on compassionate grounds in 2009 and died in 2013 at the age of 84. Bruce Reynolds had a different kind of fugitive experience, more sober, more solitary, more frightening. After the farm, he traveled through France, then to Mexico, then to Canada. He lived under assumed identities. He tried to enjoy his share of the money, but the net was tightening, and Reynolds, unlike Biggs, was a wanted man in a way that allowed no peace. He was finally arrested in Torquay in November 1968. 5 years after the robbery, he was sentenced to 25 years but released after 10. In later life, Reynolds became a respected figure in a certain strand of British culture. He wrote his memoirs, he gave interviews, he was thoughtful and articulate about what he had done and why. He expressed genuine regret about the injury to Jack Mills, whose health had never fully recovered from the blow he received in the locomotive cab that August night. Reynolds died in 2013, the same year as Ronnie Biggs, at the age of 81. Of the £2.6 million stolen that night, only approximately £400,000 was ever officially recovered. The rest, over £2 million, has never been accounted for. Some of it was spent. Some of it was hidden and recovered by gang members after their release. Some of it was moved abroad. And some of it, according to certain theories that have never been proven, may still be buried somewhere in the English countryside. The Great Train Robbery remains to this day one of the most extraordinary events in British criminal history. Not because of the violence, there was almost none. Not because of the sophistication. By modern standards, the plan was relatively simple, but because of what it represented. A group of ordinary men from ordinary backgrounds who looked at the world and decided the rules didn't apply to them, who planned something that had never been done before, who executed it with extraordinary precision, and who, for 15 glorious minutes, on a summer night in 1963, pulled off something that nobody who was there would ever forget. The Great Train Robbery. 15 men, 15 minutes, £2.6 million, and one monopoly board that became the symbol of the most audacious heist in British history.